Good afternoon. It's Maajid Nawaz here on LBC, sitting in for James O'Brien. Now, of course, we all remember the Grenfell tragedy. We all remember the heartbreak of families, watching those families stuck in a tower, being advised not to leave by health and safety fire regulations, to stay put. Meanwhile, they were advised to stay put as the inferno raged. It led to the loss of, if I recall correctly, 72 lives. It was a horrific tragedy that caught the attention of the world, not just the country. I was on air at the time. In fact, interestingly, sitting in precisely in this spot, sitting in for James at the time as the tragedy unfolded, covering the Grenfell tragedy. And we had callers calling us, survivors and others, residents calling us from the scene. It was a heartbreaking moment. There's been an inquiry. Recommendations were made. But what's happened now is that Labour MPs have slammed their Tory counterparts for voting down an amendment to a fire safety bill that aimed to include recommendations made by the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry. Have we already forgotten Grenfell? Give us a call on 03456060973. And what indeed do they, the people, the survivors in the community, need done next? LBC's correspondent Rachael Venables reports.
The Secretary of State for Housing, Robert Jenrick, was speaking this morning about a new £12 billion fund for building new affordable homes. But on LBC, he faced a series of questions about the current cladding crisis, which we've learned has trapped up to 3 million leasehold flat owners in homes that might have dangerous cladding but are now worthless and unsellable without a new survey, a new form that passes the buildings, proving them to be safe. Now, the government has put aside £1.6 billion to remove dangerous cladding from high-rise buildings, but according to their own estimations, that is nowhere near enough.
You're leaving people in effectively fire traps, but you're building new homes. Now, talk to me about the logic of that, Secretary of State.
Well, I think it's extremely important to be investing in new social and affordable homes. So I think you agree with that.
I don't know about
but
you, but I think it's quite important that we don't have another Grenfell, don't you?
Well, I do think that. That's why we're working extremely hard to alleviate that. So why are we spending £12 billion on building new homes when we've got dangerous ones still in existence? For the second time, explain the logic of that, if you would, Secretary of State. Well, because this isn't just about government investment. We are investing a significant amount of money to help get the process going faster than it is today. But there's also other routes in which this is being funded.
Now, listening to the interview was Natasha, a leaseholder in a flat in Southampton. Her building Empire View is almost entirely wrapped in dangerous HPL cladding. She doesn't know how much it'll cost to remove, but she knows that bills for similar works have run up to £100,000 per flat.
I couldn't pay it. We could not pay that bill, and I would go bankrupt. And I'm a qualified solicitor, and obviously we can't practice if we've been declared bankrupt. So I would lose my home, I'd lose any chance of a future, and I'd lose my career. It would be absolutely devastating.
Well, with that in mind, this was her reaction to Robert Jenrick's announcement this morning.
Absolutely offensive. Robert Jenrick continues to fund, keep pumping money into the developers and leaving us in a state of absolute misery. 1.6 billion is not sufficient by any assessment of the problem has said minimum 3 billion, up to 30 billion. It just isn't enough. And whilst he continues to pump money into developers that helped cause this issue and fails to acknowledge that the government regulations, were wrong, it's offensive. It's absolutely offensive and really, really upsetting for us.
Now, it all comes as yesterday a vote in the House of Commons rejected a Labour amendment to the new fire safety bill. They wanted to include recommendations that were made in the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry and to effectively enshrine them into law, a way of trying to make buildings safer. It included a requirement for the owners or managers of flats to be forced to share information with local fire services about the design, the materials on the external walls of their buildings. They'd also have been forced to carry out regular inspections of things like lifts, flat entrance doors, and to share evacuation and fire safety instructions with residents of buildings. Now, that amendment yesterday was defeated by 188 votes to 318, and people were quick to spot one name in particular on the opposing side, and that's Felicity Buchan, the new Conservative MP for Kensington and Chelsea, of course, the constituency of Grenfell. Grenfell. A statement today from Grenfell United, the group of survivors and bereaved residents, family members of those who died in Grenfell. They've said that they're outraged that their own MP voted against this amendment to implement the recommendations, saying it's no surprise that the government continue to fail the country almost a year since the recommendations. They say so little has been done. Now, Felicity Buchan, though, has responded to this. She's accusing Labour of politicising this, politicising Grenfell, saying she is actually committed to backing the recommendations, but that this amendment yesterday would have actually delayed their implementation.
And that was LBC's correspondent Rachael Venables. If I can just sum up what you just heard, the most pertinent point among many pertinent points there, and thank you, Rachael, was the point there about the cladding not being removed. What we find ourselves in is up to 3 million people in the country, 3 million I believe is correct, living in these apartments or properties that have been deemed unsafe by the government. The government has said you're living in a fire trap. Just imagine that. This cladding is unsafe to such an extent that you're not even allowed to put fairy lights on the wall because they may inflame the cladding. So let me be very clear. This is the government telling residents they're living in a fire trap because the cladding is not safe. Now, that renders the property worthless. It means you cannot sell that property, but you're stuck in it, either paying rent or a mortgage, depending on your perspective there, depending on your position. So you're stuck in this property. It's the government's responsibility to then reclad this stuff. Every day spent in this fire trap is a day that is dangerous, according to the government's own advice. Otherwise, why tell them that you can't even put up fairy lights? And that's why, in that context, if you heard my colleague there, LBC's breakfast presenter, Nick Ferrari, you can understand the force with which he put the question to the Secretary of State.
You're leaving people in, effectively, fire traps, but you're building new homes. Now, talk to me about the logic of that, Secretary of State.
Well, I think it's extremely important to be investing in new social and affordable homes. So I think you agree with that.
I don't know about you, but I think it's quite important that we don't have another Grenfell, don't you?
Well, I do think that. That's why we're working extremely hard to alleviate that. So why are we spending £12 billion on building new homes when we've got dangerous ones still in existence? For the second time, explain the logic of that, if you would, Secretary of State. Well, because this isn't just about government investment. We are investing a significant amount of money to help get the process going faster than it is today. But there's also other routes in which this is being funded.
So you heard there my colleague, breakfast presenter Nick Ferrari, understandably putting a question in the way he did, because, of course, it's the government saying to these residents that this is a fire trap, do not even put fairy lights on the wall. Meanwhile, it's the government whose responsibility is to replace that cladding, which, like Grenfell, is in danger of catching fire, and it's the government who have said both things to the residents. This is an unsafe property, we need to reclad it, and it's the government that hasn't actually done what they need to do by doing the recladding. And that means, so you've got people stuck in these properties paying rent and at the same time being told it's a fire trap and it's dangerous for you to be stuck in them. They can't move, they can't go anywhere, and the properties are worthless. It's why I'm asking, have we forgotten about Grenfell? And I think this becomes really, really important. It's in that context that Labour MPs have slammed their Tory counterparts for voting down the amendment. So there was a clause that they wanted to attach to legislation that was being debated in Parliament generally on housing regulations, and they wanted to attach the clause to implement the first phase of the Grenfell inquiry recommendations. That amendment that failed, by the way, it failed with 130 votes it lost by. Labour, Sir Keir Starmer, called it a shameful dereliction of duty. What they were seeking to do, it would have required to carry out regular inspections of lifts and individual flat entrance doors, while evacuation and fire safety instructions would be shared with residents of the building. They also wanted to make sure that the government, they implemented their promise to implement the recommendations of Phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry. Labour was seeking, as I said, to amend the bill to ensure that happened because an electrical fault in a fridge freezer, of course, sparked the fire in the first place. But that vote was defeated with a majority of 130. So you've got, on the one hand, the vote being voted down, on the other, the government telling them, right, this is a fire trap, but not fixing it and not putting anywhere near enough money to it. The conclusion I am inescapably left to draw is that when I say have we forgotten about Grenfell, it appears we have. Now, I find it very, very difficult to forget about Grenfell because I was on air at the time. I was sitting in, as I said, in this very spot, sitting in for James when it happened. I was new on LBC. It was one of my first most horrific tragedies to cover live on air. And the call that really sticks out to me that, what is it now, 3 years? Do we know, has it been 3 years? The length of time it's been since this fire, and here I am able to recall still in detail one of the most traumatizing calls that I received. And by the way, it's the only time probably since, and the only time that it will happen, that I actually shed a tear live on air. Because what happened was a survivor was there at the tower, and they were calling as the fire was still raging. Imagine that. And we're on air and we're covering this and the fire's still raging and there are human beings still stuck in the tower. And this person who called, you could probably still find it on the LBC's archive. They recalled an eyewitness. As an eyewitness said they saw children hanging their heads out of the windows and they were talking to them from the ground just to reassure them. And the caller said that the children were trying to reassure the adults on the ground. The children were the ones saying, don't worry, we'll be fine because Superman will come and save us. And of course, then the caller said, well, Superman never came. And that is really, for me, it was heartbreaking to hear that call. It was really just, for me, it summarised the extent of the tragedy and what we were dealing with, the innocence of children feeling that society, in the form of an imaginary superhero, Superman, in other words, society would help them and save them. Firemen would come and save them, the same regulations that told them to stay put, because that's the fire regulations. And unfortunately, that led to the tragedy because they followed the rules. They did exactly what they were told to do. They stayed put in the building. The people that didn't follow the rules, guess who they were? The contractors, the property developers, the local council. The rules regarding cladding were well and truly and clearly broken. The victims, 72 of them, lost their lives, stuck to the rules and did what they were told against common sense, mind you, and stayed in their buildings while the inferno was raging and the building was on fire. They stuck to the rules and they paid for it. The people that broke the rules, are they paying for it? Have we already forgotten about Grenfell? You're listening to Maajid Nawaz here on LBC and the time is 12:15.